Yeah, so today we're going to talk about Ansible and NetBox, and there's a couple different integrations that we can take advantage of. So one of them is using Ansible to configure NetBox. The second one is more around, I guess, you know, in terms of managing your configuration management. Then you can use NetBox as a single source of truth. So we'll touch on that. And then the third aspect is using NetBox as a dynamic inventory source. And I'll show you what that looks like and how to set that up. So one of the things before we start to drill down into the Ansible side of this is just to sort of take a brief moment and walk through a few slides so that we can set level set on what NetBox is. So I guess before I get too deep into here, let me pop back into this screen. Um, if you could give me a thumbs up if you're already using NetBox, so that I'll kind of gauge where everybody is in that respect. And if you're not, that's okay because I intend on doing a little bit of a one-on-one. Okay, so the majority of you don't have NetBox. Maybe you've seen it or at least seen a demo or that type of thing. But we're not going to spend too much time there. I just want to touch on it a little bit so that we can, drill into the use cases and have a little bit of context. So let me pop back into the slides and we'll walk through those quickly. So in terms of automation and single source of truth, that's important, I guess, regardless if you're building your automation based off of infrastructure as code, or if you're more focused on automation that is more driven by an ITSM. In both cases, there's going to be situations where that single source of truth may not be available directly, like in terms of like infrastructure as code. Maybe there's things that are not completely available, like in your Git repository. So if that's the place where one of the places where you're storing your configurations, and if you're working with ITSM, some of the CMDB may not encapsulate everything that's available in the network. So depending on what type of solution you have, it may serve you better to have a solution that focuses on the network configurations. So that's really what NetBox is doing, is it's providing a network source of truth. So you'll see things or data that represents different elements of the network. So like things like IPAM information, the data center infrastructure management component of it would point to things like VLANs and VRFs, and even things that are not configurable in network devices like circuit information from the carrier and that type of stuff. So there's a lot of data that can be collected and could encapsulate whatever your network source of truth includes, and then we can compare against that when using Ansible to make sure that we have a good viewpoint of what the intended state is, and as we're making changes, if we're within the baseline or not before we make a change. So this is just a quick run through of NetBox. We're going to look at NetBox. I'm going to connect to one of their sandbox environments, and we'll kind of click around and look at some of this stuff. So don't worry that you can't really see it on the screen too well here. But this is really some of the salient points, in terms of NetBox. I'm certainly not an expert in NetBox, but these are just kind of like at a high level, most of the things that you would use it for. So one of the things is, as customers in your organizations, as you're moving towards automation and adopting new best practices around net DevOps, and a lot of the best practices around provisioning and testing state and those types of things, it's also a good time to modernize the way that you present the data that you're using for your configurations. So one of the value propositions of NetBox is that it helps you eliminate a lot of the legacy methodologies. So, many IT organizations use spreadsheets. Most of them, I would think at a minimum are moving away from that for like the IPAM types of things. So, different solutions out there, vendor solutions that provide, those types of niche components like info blocks and that kind of stuff. So that's like just one category. The DCIM kind of falls into a lot of different types of configurations. So that's where NetBox has a lot of granularity, because if you look at the types of configs that you can put in there, like I mentioned, it's the whole gamut of the configurable items that typically you would find in your network devices, like your routers, your switches, your firewalls, and your load balancers. But it's also other things too, like circuit information and site information, and it really helps you, provide like a really good, viewpoint of what the configuration state is for like a particular data center. So that's their main focus area. So one of the things that we can leverage with NetBox is there is a collection. So with a collection of modules for Ansible, there's a lot of things that you can do from like a configuration standpoint, but also from accessing the data that's already available in NetBox. So the REST API is a big component of like the collection, because instead of us needing to understand and work with the REST API directly, then we have like a layer of abstraction through the modules to help orchestrate a lot of that, or to abstract, a lot of those complexities, to do the things that we want to do with NetBox and Ansible, better together. And then in terms of like, different data and other aspects of state that NetBox can also understand, like if it's learning interface state and if sites are available and that type of stuff, then we could use that in terms of notifications and webhooks and those types of things that could map back to Ansible, not so much directly to the controller, but other components of Ansible automation platform like the EDA, the event-driven Ansible. So one of the source plugins is webhooks. So NetBox could effectively learn and share a state that triggers like an alarm type of situation that we want to update to EDA. We're not really going to look at that today. We're going to look more closer into the programmability aspects, and also the dynamic inventory components as well. But if you wanted to, you could explore NetBox and EDA, as something that potentially would provide you some capabilities that would be better together, between the two solutions. So that's kind of like the high level of NetBox. And again, when we go into the NetBox, you'll see it'll become more apparent if you haven't seen it before, the types of configs that you can store within its database. But one of the things here is, I guess, you know, for us to conceptualize sort of where NetBox sits in a typical infrastructure and in terms of automation. So in a modern network automation architecture, there's a lot of different choices. So some of these are effectively like a placeholder, and then it's listing out like some of the options, because NetBox, is not like opinionated in terms of what you're using. So it supports a pretty broad ecosystem of the types of other vendor connections that you can make in terms of like their plugins and things like that. So for our intents and purposes of showing automation today, then we're looking at Ansible, and specifically the Ansible automation platform. So we kind of sit here in terms of automation. So we would be the provisioner, or making changes to configurations, understanding if we need to do like configuration drift checks and to see if there's diffs in the existing state of the devices, and comparing to what the configs are in the NetBox. So that's one of the things that we will do, is I'll show you in a demonstration what that looks like. So the network, could potentially be anything, right? So they support all your best of breed vendors that you would expect to see. Um, in this particular lab environment that I'm using, I have Juniper, Cisco, and Arista routers. So that's a decent representation of what we have in there. But for like making configuration changes to kind of simplify it for today, I'm really just going to mess with the Cisco router that's in my sandbox environment. So I guess we'll start here, like from like the viewpoint of Ansible, kind of in this architecture, and in particular, like kind of see how we interact with NetBox. So with automation, and depending on like what we're doing, so I guess like in this example, it's showing more of like the ITSM driven automation. So we could have like a ServiceNow or a similar tool that's kind of front ending everything, and also maintaining like a CMDB database that needs to be updated as well as we're making changes. So from an automation perspective, that might be front ended with self service. So if ServiceNow with particular environment that's in terms of the configuration is initiated from ServiceNow, so front ended by ServiceNow. So if we want to initiate a change, right, or initiate an update, like it says here, so we want to build some configuration in our device, which may represent some type of tenant configuration or a security policy or whatever in our network devices. Then we could have ServiceNow, pass that data, those variables, to our Ansible. So Ansible typically runs, through abstraction, through playbooks. And then under the hood, we have our modules, collections of modules, right, from these vendors. And normally those are written in Python for most of the network devices, right? So there's an abstraction there, and we can populate variables and we can push config changes to these network devices. But normally we don't want to do that directly. We want to introduce what we would call a configuration drift check, to check the state of what we think is the intended configuration, or in this case, the network source of truth. So we would call into using the collection to NetBox, right? And we would request that configuration for whatever the device is. So in NetBox, you can set up sites and devices, and um, that's really good information too for like an inventory. So hence, a dynamic inventory could be sourced from NetBox as well. So we would pull that down, and that would have like the IP address information and any other information that's needed to populate variables for like OS type and whatever, depending on what type of vendor device it is, to populate our our Ansible configuration, right? So we want to check here first, and normally what we'll do as well is check the configuration that's in the single source of truth, or in this case, the network source of truth, against what our configuration is, which could be based off of YAML files or really any of the formats that we want to use to populate those parameters in our playbook. So that could be derived from like a Git repository, or that's the recommended way, but could potentially be like a local path on this Ansible automation controller. So we have those configurations. So we want to see if there's any differences there. And then the more importantly, we want to see what the running configuration is in these devices, right? So we could have something that deviates from our intended configuration really in any one of these, right? So then we have to determine, do we want to overwrite it, or do we want to ingest it, into the network source of truth and update that? Oh, sorry about that. Going the wrong direction, right? So we need to, understand, do we want to make a change, once we have a difference, and how we want to reconcile that. So that's important. So that way we're not updating and overriding configs that somebody troubleshot an issue, and we really should, ingest that into the intended state and update it on the automation side of things. So we want to definitely, key into here. So other aspects of this are, as we're making configuration changes to these network devices, right, then we're impacting those environments, either good or bad impacts to whatever the environment is. So hopefully we're working in different types of environments in terms of having like a dev environment, a staging environment, a production environment, right? And the best practice, or kind of the panacea of having viewpoints of those different environments, is to introduce your operations tools into each one of those environments. So that way, through observability and assurance, you can see what the impact is of those configurations, and hopefully solve any anomalies before you push a change into production. But at a minimal, if you're making a change in production, it's during a downtime and it's a part of your change management, all that kind of stuff. But we definitely want the viewpoint, from different management systems and observability systems and application performance systems to see, if our network change has impacted, any of our services. So the more viewpoints, the better. So that's another integration point, back to NetBox, is that it has the ability, to pull in different telemetry and other, operational state as we're making changes. And then if something is off there, then we would have that as well as a source to potentially, redo automation, or again, it that's really clearly like a good integration point for EDA from the Ansible side of things, the event-driven Ansible, because NetBox could, create a webhook because something's impacted the operational state, to tell Ansible to run a different playbook to either roll back the change or triage some troubleshooting, automate some troubleshooting, and things of that nature. So that's kind of like the full loop here. And then obviously the front end is also the back end, because if we have an ITSM system, after we make these changes, then we need to update the CMDB as well. And that would also be something that we could, point that to NetBox for the network components of whatever our change was. And again, this is just kind of like an example of this. It's not necessarily how you may have this implemented in your environment. But it's, as we're seeing more layers of single source of truth, being added into the different IT domains, we're seeing, the ability to actually, improve a lot of the automation process that's in that particular stack. So it gives us that feedback loop, or what they, call here a closed loop network automation stack. And again, if you have different environments, that's even better. So you can kind of vet out any of these changes and what the impact might be. So when we run through the demo, I don't have ServiceNow plugged into it, so it's really just this part. We'll have the NetBox, the automation, and then the network devices. And I don't have observability, but we could turn on that, or I could have had the devices like enable like telemetry, so they could use streaming telemetry to update as we make changes. So all those things could have been added, but for this one, we'll keep it kind of simple. So the dynamic inventory is important to understand, and there's nothing different about using NetBox as a dynamic inventory than any other dynamic inventory source that you can use with your Ansible or the Ansible automation platform. It still requires you to create a YAML file like for the configuration, and you're calling the inventory plugin that's a part of the collection. And it works alongside any of your group vars and host vars that you define as well. So works the exact same as every other dynamic inventory. And it's also important to understand that dynamic inventories are not mutually exclusive, so you can have more than one. So that way you can populate different groups in your main inventory based off of different sources. So in this example, we're just using NetBox. But for us to have the NetBox dynamic inventory, we need to configure NetBox first. So I'm just going to create a site and a router that we can use. And then we'll use that, pull it down, and populate our dynamic inventory to be able to run playbooks against it in our automation controller. And then once that's all there, we can do some configuration drift checking to make sure that our intended config is in alignment with NetBox and the running config. And when it's not, we'll see how we can review those diffs in Ansible. And then from there, we could decide what the next step would be. And the next step could be to accept configurations or to overwrite them, as an example. So so this is what we're going to do: configure it, NetBox, use the dynamic inventory, and then do some checks for the configuration drift. And then these are just some references. Most of it's NetBox stuff, a little bit of Ansible. And I'll make this slide available after the meetup. And I'll just, what I do is if you go to past events, if you haven't joined one of these before, you can go back. And then I usually put the link of the recording, and then also any slide decks or like repo links or anything like that that complements whatever we talked about in that meetup. And you'll be able to grab that shortly after this is over and download the PDF of these slides. So don't worry about screenshotting links and things like that. So I may have forgot, because I was muted earlier. I didn't introduce myself again. So if you're joining for the first time, my name's Tony Dubiel, and I'm a product solutions architect for Red Hat, and I focus on network automation. And I'm a part of our North America public sector. So primarily like our federal and local state government types of customers. But I learn a lot from different use cases from commercial and enterprise as well. So if you have something in particular that you want to talk about as we go through this, feel free to unmute yourself because a lot of times I don't notice like the chat as I'm in different screens, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And probably before I jump into the live demo, does anybody have any questions right now for just NetBox in general?
Hi, Mr. Dubiel. My name is Stephen Sloop. I'm a network engineer at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and uh, we're talking here about when you've gotten to that state where NetBox is your single source of truth, um, and it seems like the really hard part comes before that sometimes, where you've got an established network that is Um, as far as brownfields go, the network tends to be the brownest of brownfields.
Yeah.
And the challenge seems to be um, getting to that point where NetBox or whatever solution you're using can be that single source of truth, which often means going out and interrogating every single network device
Hmm.
out there. And even then, you sometimes miss things like, oh, you didn't know that circuit was run into the data center. Yeah, it's been there for years. We use that for our backup to the cold site over in Reston or things like that. So I guess um, it's awesome to have tools once you've gotten to that point where you're at that single source of truth. But um, do you or does Red Hat have suite of tools available for network discovery that help you get to that point and bridge that gap?
Okay. Yeah. So with NetBox, I think like earlier on, a lot of that discovery was just you know that was aside from NetBox, and you had to do a lot of manual entry. For those configurations. Recently, they do have like a plugin that's like for discovery. I haven't used it yet, so I'm not sure exactly like what limitations it has in terms of like your existing brownfield. How much of that configuration can it learn directly? So I'll have to look at that one, but I have some capabilities there. With Ansible, the way that it could potentially work is we have validated content now, and in the validated content there is a role. Are you familiar with it? Have you been using Ansible at all up until this point?
I tend towards using just pure Python and like that Miko and that sort of thing. I dabble in Ansible sometimes, but um, I've had better luck just writing things directly in Python.
Okay, so the way our validated content works is that so we have modules that they're in Python, right? So the abstraction is in Ansible is the playbook. So you're front ended by YAML and a playbook, and you're just defining parameters there. And those playbooks, the intention is for them not to be too complicated. So mostly playbooks are written to include like the the mandatory parameters that you have to do to like say that here's the type of devices we're going to connect to, the connection types, um, the groups in our inventory. So what devices do we want to run this playbook against? So that's very specific, to that automation run. But when we get into like the meat of the playbook, normally as folks are adopting Ansible, they'll create roles or they'll use roles that were provided by the vendors. And in those roles, those are like purpose-built playbooks that have been variablized. So they're meant to be, shared and used where the playbook itself is separate from the configuration, and the roles would typically point to a specific type of use case. The validated content, you could think of them as very intelligent roles that the vendors write and Red Hat creates, depending on which ones we're talking about. and those roles will call like other roles. So it's kind of like a way of like orchestrating between roles, and it makes the playbooks very powerful because you don't have to write a lot of content in terms of the playbook itself. You're just telling the role like here's some variables for the role to work, and one of the roles is called the network.base, and it has what they call an action, and the action persist will go out to existing devices in your inventory, and it pulls in their configuration. So whatever their native configuration is, depending on the vendor, it'll pull that in, like Cisco command line configuration or netcomp from like a Juniper device, or the command line from the EOS from Arista. And if it's a firewall or whatever, it's a REST API or a command line type of native configuration, it pulls that in and it converts it to structured data, and it creates some configuration files. So it'll pull in like all these configs, create these configuration files. The default would be host vars that are written in like YAML. And when you have those there, what you can do, like the way that it works with NetBox, is you can use Ansible to configure NetBox, right? So you could push those configurations, and the way that NetBox uses the configurations is it uses Jinja 2 templates, so you can um, convert that into a Jinja 2 template that like iterates through that data and then creates like a configuration that you can use in NetBox. So you could use Ansible to do the discovery and then populate NetBox. The NetBox has a way of doing a discovery. I just don't know how detailed that is. So there may be certain things that you may need to round out, that it can't pull in like directly. But with either one of those, you can, learn, whatever the configuration is that way for the existing stuff. And then for new things that you're building, then again, like you could use Ansible to deploy and then update NetBox, or you could have people, create these brand, net new configurations in NetBox and use that, to represent a configuration that you're pushing, using Ansible. So Ansible can kind of, you know, it can provide, a different role depending on what you need, or it can allow like the other system to do that piece of it. But I guess the last part of it, like with like Python scripting, like if you have stuff that you really like that you've written in Python, you can create a custom module, and then the custom module, you can wrap that into a collection that you store locally in what we call the private automation hub, and then other people can have access to your Python script front ended by a playbook. So then you're just having them populate parameters, so they don't have to actually create like anything like a Python script themselves, or use other tools like um, NetMiko or Nornir, something like that. They could just use Ansible playbooks around it. So kind of babbled on there, but hopefully that answer your question on sort of how different ways it could work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. And somebody was yeah, so NetBox instead of Nautobot. Nautobot is like a fork of NetBox. So again, I don't know the complete history of this, but like with NetBox, it's open source, but then there's NetBox Labs, and they were like the main or the original main contributor of like NetBox. Just like Ansible used to be a company that supported like open source Ansible, and then Red Hat had acquired them. So Ansible's there's a product of Ansible that's Red Hat, and then there's still the open source Ansible. So I think NetBox is kind of the same situation, but the Nautobot was like a fork, and I think that like the main contributor of that fork of NetBox is network to code. So there's going to be like some differences in the way that they work, but I guess in principle they're kind of the same thing, but just like some of the underpinnings will be different, um, because they would have different plugins and that kind of stuff. But today this is clearly this is NetBox. So for NetBox, let me find that link so I can oh, I already have it over here. So if everyone's okay, I'm going to go ahead and go into NetBox, and then this link here, I'll put this in the chat in case anyone wants to see this later. Actually, just this part of it. You can access this on demand. It's like an always available type of sandbox. So I'll pop that in over here. Oops. And that's what I'm connecting to. So the default is just admin, and that'll give you access to it. But then it doesn't really do anything until you create a token. So I think I did this one yesterday, so I need to do another one, or this might be somebody else's. So just to make sure, I'm going to go ahead into this section here, and I'm going to add a token. And then it's important for you to copy that because you only get one chance. So I'm going to go ahead and save that here and delete this old one. And then you have to create it before it'll do anything. So now this one ending in D2 is mine. So I have a token. So the other thing is just a real quick look at what's in here. So I mentioned, NetBox has like high level stuff like sites. So you can click into these and you can see that there's a ton of different sites in here. So this is just like other lab stuff that people had added in here, and just stuff that's a part of their demos. So we haven't added any of our own sites. So I'm going to add one that's called RTP, and I'm going to add one of the Cisco routers and just call it router 1, but it doesn't exist yet in here. Yeah, so they can't find it yet. And then when you have a site defined and you start adding devices, then you can drill down into devices. So I'll just click in here, and there's going to be a lot of different types of devices. You can see over here, it shows the manufacturer and the type of device it is. So there's a bunch of different like Cisco routers and catalysts and things like that. So we need to like define, our site and the type of router that we want to update and those types of things. So we'll add to that. And then this is just, the boilerplate stuff that's in here, are just things that other people added. Like if you like went in here right now, I think you could just go in and add stuff and then we would see it also. So most of this is drill down types of things and different configurations that you can populate as far as your network configs. And then here's the stuff that we were talking about too, is like things that weren't like the actual device configs. So there's all sorts of different information around like cables and all that kind of stuff too. So when you get into the nitty gritty of that type of information, that's stuff that you're not going to see populated anywhere else, which typically probably would have been like a spreadsheet or something like that. So now, you can add those vectors to whatever you're tracking for the network in here instead of, legacy methods. So there's a lot of different stuff. Here's some IPAM things that you have in here. Also, your ASNs, like if you're doing BGP, there's a lot of, router specific things, VRFs, VLANs, all that kind of stuff. So it's, again, things that are specific to networking in particular. So we'll go ahead and kind of table the NetBox for a second. And what I want to do is I'm going to go into my automation controller. So if you haven't seen this before, this is the GUI for the Ansible automation platform. And this particular component of it is the automation controller, which used to be called Tower. So you may be familiar with that if you've used this in the past. The difference is there's multiple components now. We used to only have a controller. Now we have a repo that's called the Private Automation Hub. The way that we scale out is different. We have this automation mesh, and we also have that EDA that I mentioned, the event-driven Ansible, that allows you to create like feedback loops and respond to triggers that you would create from conditions like actions. And those actions are typically like running playbooks and workflows and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to log in here. I'm just using like a temporary environment, so I don't know what my password is until I go to the other screen. So we'll go into templates here. And templates are how we configure the parameters for running our playbooks. So a template maps to a playbook. So let me just look for NetBox stuff. So here's some of the NetBox ones that we'll look at. So here's the setup one. So if I go into here, you can see that I'm pointing to this playbook. So the way that we navigate to where the playbook is stored is defined in a project. So if I click on a project, so the student project here is pointing to a repo. So this is a Git T. It's sort of like a GitHub or a GitLab, but it's a free one that you can run as a container, and I'm just running it in this lab environment. But it works the exact same way. It uses all the same commands and similar APIs and all that kind of stuff. So when we want to run a playbook, what we do is we pull down the current playbook as it's committed to this repo, and then we pull it down into this project-based path, and then that's the actual playbook that we're going to run. So we store some the playbooks and other content locally, but we're always pulling it down from the repo. So this is actually like a local repository here, and then we're pulling it down from the remote repository. So every time we're making a change, and that works in both directions. Sometimes we're pulling down information, sometimes we're updating information in the repo. So I may have some examples of that, like actually pushing changes, and if I do, I'll make sure I point that out. So that's the project. The other thing that's important is the inventory. So one of the inventories that I have is this NetBox inventory, but there's nothing in it yet, and we're not ready to run this yet because we need to configure some stuff first in NetBox. So what I want to do is go back into those templates and this setup one, right? So I'm going to go ahead and bring this one up. And you can see that there's different parameters that are set here. There's other ones that are not configured. So if I go into edit, you can see there's a lot of different things that we can turn on when we run the playbook. And this is tantamount to what we would see when you run like Ansible playbook commands and you have different options and flags that you can set there. This is like the GUI version of that. So we're just going to run the playbook, and it's going to run this setup NetBox, and it's going to run it in run mode. So that means it's actually going to make changes. If we wanted to see what was going to happen, we can run this in check mode, which is like one of the ways that we do a lot of like compliance checks where we don't want to make the actual change immediately, but we want to see what needs to change. So for this one, we're going to go ahead and run it. But before I run it, I want to show you like where this is coming from. So this is the playbook. And then it's pointing to that repo locally, but I also have this, when I pull that repo down, I'm pulling it down from this GitLab. So it's a little bit easier to see it from here. So I'm just going to go into here, into this NetBox section, and I can show you what the playbooks and stuff look like from here. So this setup NetBox, right? So one thing that we need is this NetBox token, and that's why I had to save it. So normally I would create what we call a credential, and that creates a encrypted credential that I can store here in the automation platform. But because I have to keep getting that token all the time, I'm not going to create a credential because it's just easier for me to find out what it is, and then I can just use a prompt to push that token at the runtime of the playbook and just do it that way. But if it was something that was going to stay available, then it makes sense to create a credential in here, and then it stores it, encrypt it in the automation controller. So I'm going to go down here and copy this because I don't know if it's still on my clipboard. And you would need a token too for any of the automation that you want to do against NetBox. So we have the token. Just hit save, and I'll hit launch, and it's prompting me for that token. All right, so there's the token, and then the next screen is just kind of showing you like what everything's configured as. These credentials are for actually connecting to the routers themselves. It's not for NetBox. And then I'm going to launch this, and when I launch it, it creates a job. So we can see this playbook is running over here. And this is like the standard output. So you can see I'm setting up the manufacturer, device types, different platforms. And then this last part here is when I mentioned that you can take the configurations of these devices, and in NetBox, you can create these Jinja 2 templates. And then that's how NetBox like pulls in configs or configurable items from its database, and you can variabilize like different placeholders in the Jinja 2 template. It'll populate them, and then that's what it pushes to a device to configure it. So in our case, we're just using these configs to compare against. We're actually going to make changes using Ansible. So that one with the template here, if I drill down into this, you can see that it has this like device configuration. But one thing to note is when I created this configuration to populate the template, it was a while ago. So you can see how the date is February 9th. And there's other items in here in this configuration that are going to be different than the router that we're actually going to configure. So we'll see those as diffs. Because when I reserve one of these sandboxes from Red Hat, it gives me a different router. So like the private IP address will be different, and serial numbers and things like that will be different. So it'll actually highlight those differences for us, and it gives us an example of what it looks like when the config isn't already the exact same as the one that's in NetBox. So so since I ran this, so some of the other things that we did is the config template and then create a device. So when I click into here, we created this router 1 device based, and we're using that template to populate it. So really the only variable placeholder that I have in that Jinja 2 template is the router name. So you'll see that that actually changes to router 1 when we go into NetBox. But before I go into NetBox, just to show you what that looks like. So if I go into here and I'm going to, oh, I didn't want to go that far back. Hold on. Didn't mean to do that. Go here. All right. So in that NetBox, where's NetBox? NetBox. Yeah. So in this setup NetBox here, when we scroll down, this is what I'm sending for the template. So most of this is just hard coded. But really what I would do in practice is all these things that are going to be potentially different, I would create variables for those, or I could ignore lines, certain lines that I don't care about. But here's an example of like a variable placeholder. So here I'm saying with the host name, it's going to create this in the template that it's sending to NetBox. So that way NetBox will look for device.name in its configuration, and it will update router 1 because we configured a router 1 in the step below this. Well, way below this. Yeah, this. This is where we're creating the actual router 1. So it'll use that as a placeholder. So we're creating like a variable inside of the Jinja 2 template. That'll make more sense when we look at it on the other side. I know it gets kind of confusing because we're using automation to create a template to configure a configuration into a template type of thing. All right, so when I go back into here, this time I'm going to go up into devices and router 1. All right, so now we have router 1, and we can see it's Cisco. It's a Catalyst 8000V, and the site is RTP, which didn't exist earlier either. So if I went back up to the organization stuff, sites, or oops, can't type. RTP, right? So if I click into here, I just put like minimal information to populate this. But this represents a site, and then I have a device that's in that site. So back to here and router 1. And then in router 1, if I click into here, here's some information that was configured, right? So we didn't have to go into NetBox and populate this. It's just, we pushed this config for this device. The thing about the template is here. So render config. So when I click into here, or actually config, it's not here. This is when you actually render it, like when you're going to use that template to make a configuration change. So in devices, where's it at? I know there's like a template section in here. Devices, device types, modules, manufacturers. Maybe if I just search template. Or I think it tells me somewhere in that config. Let me go back to that one. It'll tell me where it's at.
I
Device.
think it's config context.
It may be. I know I was able to click on it from somewhere in here, and it takes me to it. So let's see what this one does. Well, this was something I added for a variable because I wanted the variable to be called Ansible underscore host so that we could use that in Ansible. But in here, blah, blah, blah. External change log. Yeah, config template. Yeah, it should be something I click here. So when I ran that, let me just see what happened when I ran it just to make sure that it did the thing I thought it did. Create config template. Config templates. So it seems like there should be something in there that's config templates. I wonder if I can just use this directly. Well, you have to do Control C from in here at this window. Yeah, because there's all the config for it. So there's got to be a GUI link. I think it would be here though. Config templates. Is it further down? Which devices, modules. All right, I'll find. I mean, it's in there because we see it from the API. I'll remember where how I had to go to actually see it, which I thought was just like a link right here, but evidently not. Or what's this down here? Rendered config down. Well, there's no configuration template found. Yeah, this part's confusing me. Let's see. So when it has an ID, maybe I haven't ran that part yet. So let me just see. I haven't ran this one in a while. So let me just look into here again and see what the next thing is we're going to do. It seems like it should have, definitely created it. So this is the one to create it. Sorry, it's kind of long, so it's hard to scroll to. So we created it, but maybe I didn't. Where's the next task here? This creates the device. So maybe we haven't done that part yet. Maybe I'm just not remembering this. So if I go back into here, into NetBox, so compared intended versus actual, and I have a couple of roles. Let's see, in the roles, put config template. Yeah, I think this is where we do it here. So I haven't attached it yet. So we should see that later as we go into that part of it. So that's my mistake for I couldn't quite remember when we do that. But that template will be configured for our comparison. So it just isn't in there yet. So we've created the device and all that stuff. So now that that's in there, the real next step is for the dynamic inventory. So for the inventories, I need to make sure I still have that key because we're going to need it again. So I need this token. Again, I would create a credential so I wouldn't have to paste it in. But again, since it's only going to last for this one session or whatever, I'm just doing it this way. So if we go into our inventory, all right, so here's the NetBox inventory. And then we have a source. So the source is NetBox, right? And you can see there's a placeholder here for an extra variable. So I'll have to go into edit and we'll paste that in there. All right, so now I have that token. So when I sync this, this is going to pull down really everything that's configured in there, but what we care about is the router one site. So it's going to create like a host entry for that one. And that's the one that we're going to call in our playbook. So I'm going to do that in a second. But before I do that, just for context again, let me jump back into here and we go into NetBox, or actually not in NetBox. We have to kind of pop out of that. I have dynamic inventories in here. So here's the NetBox one. So here's the configuration that I had to set up, for NetBox. So really the main part of it is the plugin. So this plugin is a part of the collection. So there's collections of modules, but there's also plugins like inventory plugins that are also wrapped in that collection. And this is the one that we're using. So this means that I have to have that collection for NetBox installed. And when we're using the automation platform, it's installed in what we call an execution environment, which is a container that's running. So we don't see that because we're working through the GUI, but behind the scenes, there's a container that's running that has all of the necessary collections installed. So one thing that people ask sometimes is, how do you know what collections are installed in your execution environment? So to see that one, and I saved this in here so we can come back to this, just to show you that real quick, is if I go back to the inventory and go to groups, and there's nothing in there, so I can't use that one. Let me go back to inventories and just use one that has stuff in it. Groups. See this run command? This is to run an ad hoc command on your controller. So if I just run a command, I can do the Ansible Galaxy collection list. Right, so it's just, as if I was running an ad hoc command, from the Linux shell. And then I don't want to run it against a bunch of devices. I just want to do localhost and just run it one time. And then, yeah, that's everything I need here. Next, validated network is the collection that I'm running for these demos. Or not the collection, the execution environment that I'm running. And then just give it credential so it'll run, launch. And these are all the collections that I have installed in that EE, which is a container that's running underneath the controller. And it also has the Ansible core engine is also in that container. So that's why all these collections have to be co-installed with that in the container, and that's what the platform is using when it launches the playbook. So what were we doing? We were doing NetBox stuff, right? So NetBox right here, netbox.netbox. And that's the version of the collection that we're using. Okay, so we did that. I didn't do the inventory, so let's do that real quick. NetBox inventory, go to the source of the inventory. I can click here. I could have clicked on the side, but we want to sync that. And then when we look at our NetBox inventory, it might take it a little bit to, let me see if it's running. So it's syncing right now with NetBox. So it's going to take a little bit because there was a lot of stuff in there. So it's going to want to pull everything, all those devices that were in there. All right, so that's done. So I go back to the inventory and go in NetBox and look in these hosts. I'm going to just search for the one we care about, router 1. All right, so when I click on router 1 and make this larger so you can see, this is all the data that it pulled in from NetBox. So there's quite a bit of data that's useful, like for inventory purposes. So like this platform and all this, I could map that to like the iOS type, but I don't have to directly because I mentioned earlier you can still maintain your group vars and your host vars. So that information I have already populated, but what I don't know is the IP address. So we're learning this variable Ansible host from NetBox. So this is the IP address for us to access that router. So now we have, we can connect to router 1. So the other part of it would be here in NetBox. So go back to NetBox. So we go into NetBox and you can see that I have host vars in here. So this is what I've established for a Cisco router. This is the OS. So this is just the fully qualified name for the OS. So it's cisco.ios.ios. And then I could have put Cisco, or I'm sorry, it's the net common is the collection that we use for the network _ CLI. So I could have put that in, like the full path or qualified name for that. But it also just understands this network _ CLI. And that's because when I'm communicating with a Cisco iOS XE type of router, I'm using command line automation to connect to it. It doesn't have a REST API. Some of them have both a REST API or the command line option. So this one's just the command line, and then it's going to use SSH, underneath that. So I define that explicitly here, and then we learned what its IP address was. As you can see, there's no Ansible host here from NetBox. So back here, at this point, we have our inventory, so I can run playbooks using that inventory. So the playbook I'm going to do is an easy one. Just it's like a gather facts. And when we gather facts or network facts, we just learn configurations about the device and its current configuration state. So that one is this playbook here that's in that same project. So it's still pointing back to that repo. And I'm going to run this one real quick. And I'll show you the playbook while that's running. So NetBox and then facts. And you can see it has this sites _ RTP. So that's a group. So in that group, we have the router 1 that we pulled in. So that should learn its IP address from that. And it should, go connect to that router. And it's just going to do a subset of all. So that's going to show us kind of like gather subset all will show the hardware information and like the show ver, like version of the software type of thing, and just like basic configs for like the interfaces and things like that. So it'll pull that back. You can have different levels of what you want to see in your facts. So this one is like 3 different components are comprised in this. And then there's also the network resource facts that you can pull into that are like very detailed depending on resource modules. And we didn't really get into resource modules, but they're like really abstracted modules that have a lot of good scope data that you can work with. All right, so go back to this one, details. So when I click in here, then that's what this is. So it's the config interfaces hardware and default. I think default is just showing you like the show ver information, but we get everything that was included in all. So it's going to pull in all this different data, and you can see that this is JSON structured data. So it's key values. So this is like the existing config. There's that private IP address. You can see all the config of the device that it pulls in using the gather facts or the iOS. All right, so we did that, and we used our inventory that we pulled down from the NetBox. So the last part of this is we mentioned that template, right? So when I run this one, this is going to do the diff. And this won't take too long. I just noticed we went over on time, so sorry about that. So if I go to this compare configs, and we'll run that one, it's going to want that key again. Then I'll launch it. So here's how we're comparing against what NetBox says is the network source of truth versus what the device has. And there's going to be some differences. Go to jobs. So it's syncing the inventory because it's dynamic, right? So every time it's going to want to go back and sync that inventory. And then now it's running the actual playbook. Okay, so in terms of differences, we can see it here on the standard output, and also if I click into the JSON, and it's showing. Let me scroll all the way up to the top. So there's a before and after. So the before would be what's in the device, so like the running config on router 1, and then the after is the green. So that's what's in the template from NetBox. So anytime there's something different, it's pointing that out. The ones that are the same are just in black font. But whenever there's a difference, it's going to show what those differences are. So it's just dumb things, right? Because they have different keys that were in there, obviously, because it's a different router, a different sandbox. And then their serial number is different. So normally this is not going to be the case when you're doing a diff against your routers that don't change, right? So they're not going to change their serial number or whatever. So here the IPs are different, right? So things like the banner is different because I was messing with a different lab that created a banner. So those are all differences, and then I can also click into it, and you can see from in here, and it's like comparing the two together in here as well. So all of this information, the JSON is important because it saves those as artifacts, and you can download them. So you can compare them as well. Like each one of these jobs creates its artifacts, and if you want to download them out of the controller, you can do that as well. So that gives you access to that. And then just real quick, just to show you that playbook that I just ran. Oh, I know. I wanted to go back here now and look at router 1. And then this shows a rendered config, right? So the template had a placeholder for here. So it learned router 1 from the device.name config, which is this, right? So this is what your rendered config looks like. But the actual template now has a link. So this is what I couldn't remember. So here's the template right here that we pushed into NetBox. So normally we would have a bunch of variable placeholders, and then we would be comparing. Each one of them would be something that's already configured in this database that would populate the placeholder here. And then this would create a config. The render config means that I could use this and push this to a device directly from NetBox. But what we're doing is we're using it just for configuration purposes from Ansible, because we're going to use Ansible to actually make changes. Because Ansible it's not bound by just using Jinja 2, so it's more efficient using like resource modules and all that kind of stuff. But this is all that NetBox has, is the template capability, which is similar to like other solutions like DNA Center and stuff like that. They have Jinja 2 templates that they're decent. You can make configuration changes, but you have to be very careful, like syntax wise. Where resource modules and Ansible are, those parameters are all abstracted, right? So it's a lot easier to work with, especially if you have different vendors or different types of devices like firewalls and things. It really normalizes a lot of that stuff.